Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. This is a podcast where we study the nature of reactivity. We notice what's going on in us and how what's going on in us is infecting all of our precious relationships. You know, when you think your precious relationships, of course, you think your people, right? But I'm also thinking difficult people. Like what's going on in me and how does that infect my relationship with difficult people? Also, people with difficulties, people on the margins, under-resourced people, people that God commands us to serve and love. Our relationship with God is one of our precious relationships, and sometimes the most elusive relationship of all, or maybe the most neglected relationship with all, our relationship with ourself. So being human is all about being human-sized, noticing when you're reactive, noticing patterns in your relationships so you can relax into God's presence, be human-sized, and deepen all your relationships. Today, we have a guest, Joy Allmond. Joy is the executive editor of Christianity Today, who, of course, is also the host of this podcast. And before Joy was the executive editor of Christianity Today, she was a flight attendant. Joy and I were chatting. I'm a columnist for CT, and we were chatting several months ago about my upcoming column, and we got to talking about travel. And I didn't know that Joy used to be a flight attendant. And I started peppering her with all these questions about travel because I notice in my field, people are so heightened with the reactivity in airports and on airplanes. So I said to Joy, I was like, I'd love to get you on the show and just talk about your time as a flight attendant, what it was like, what you notice about anxiety. So we get into that. Also, Joy was a flight attendant during September 11th, 2001. In fact, she was on one of the very first flights after the Twin Towers fell, and she talks to us about that on the episode as well. We also get a little bit into Christianity Today, what it's about, what we're both excited about, and the mission of that wonderful organization. So before we get to Joy, let's light our candle. Every time on Being Human, we just pause and we light a candle to relax into the Lord. Because our relationship with God is invisible, and sometimes that means it's intangible. And just pausing to relax into God's presence, to be able to see the light and remember that God is closer to me than the light I can see now. Okay, I started out by asking Joy, why do people not walk in a straight line when they're at an airport? Let's catch up now.
I think it's the same reason people can't drive well in weather, especially here in the South. Especially when it snows, which it doesn't very often here, they're out of their norm, out of their routine, and they pretty much forget anyone else exists in the universe because they're radar locked on where they're going. Just like when it's snowing, those of us Southerners who are not as well equipped to drive in the snow. Now, I will pause and say, I think I am an above average Southerner driving in the snow, just because I lived in Washington, D.C. for a short stint of my adulthood, and that's where I learned. But I think it's because we are so focused on self, if you want a deep answer. We are so focused on self and where we are going, that we just lose sight of everyone else.
Now, is it the same with travel as it is with driving in the South? Like I lived in Tennessee for a number of years, and it seemed to me that every time it snowed, people forgot that it has ever snowed before. Like they acted like it's the first time they've had to drive in snow.
Absolutely. Yes. It is that way here in North Carolina. I too lived in Tennessee, but I think you're on to something. We think that we are the only ones who are having to deal with something, right? And we oftentimes, whether it's something as trivial as a snowstorm or a personal crisis, I mean, it's not trivial. We're not the only people who've ever tread those streets before. So, yeah, you're on to something for sure.
So what got you into being a flight attendant, and then what got you out of it?
I became a flight attendant by accident. So, gosh, this was long. The listeners are going to know how old I am when this is all over, which is fine. So it was 1999. I was graduating from college. And, you know, back, that's pre social media, pre LinkedIn, pre all things, finding a job was completely different than it is now. And at the time, I was really struggling to find something in my field. Everyone wanted 3 to 5 years of experience. But then I thought, you know what? I'm young, I'm single. It was US Airways. If you remember that airline, I think they were absorbed by American sometime back. They were hiring. And I thought it would be a really great way to, for a short time of my adult life, see the world. I knew I would not be doing it as a lifelong career. My aunt has, and I think I probably subconsciously got the idea from her. She has been a flight attendant since 1983, still doing it. And I think subconsciously that's probably where the seed got planted. So, I got hired and I moved from Wilmington, North Carolina, where I grew up, and went to undergrad to the Washington, D.C. area, which is a complete culture change in and of itself, right? That's huge culture change from having lived in southeastern North Carolina for the first 22 years of your life. So that's how I came to be a flight attendant. And in hindsight, it's kind of funny to think about, because the line from flight attendant to leading in a global media ministry, it doesn't really seem straight. But I kind of joke that I have a lot in common with Forrest Gump, and that I've really done a lot of everything. So I've spent the last almost 2 decades in this sort of evangelical media space. But prior to that, I did work in the financial industry. And then, of course, prior to that, I was a flight attendant. So that's how I came to be. And also in hindsight, it really was formative for me as a young adult, which I know we'll get into a little bit later. So when I look back, I don't see it as time wasted. I saw it as time wasted given the trajectory I'm on when I was in my 30s. But now, well into my 40s, I look back on it and I thank God for it, because I think it really helped form me in ways that might not have been obvious at the moment.
Yeah, I think, Joy, when most people think anxiety, they think worry and fear. They think people may be cowering. But what I try to help people understand is anxiety can often look like an outburst, bad behavior. It feels like that's the kind of anxiety you dealt with most as a flight attendant, is people behaving badly to you and to other passengers. What's your reaction to that?
I would say that is largely true. I will never forget the first Christmas I spent as a flight attendant. I worked on Christmas Day. So that in and of itself was it was a very hard pivot from either growing up in my parents' house and just being there for Christmas, or going home on Christmas break from college, to landing in the Detroit airport on Christmas Day and just having to let a phone call suffice, because back then we didn't even have FaceTime. We didn't have Zoom. We didn't have those things. I'll never forget. And this was, of course, a holiday. And so there's something about, and I think this is apt to talk about, because as you and I are recording this right now, we are staring at the holiday season. And there's something about the holidays that can bring out the best in people. and it can bring out the worst in people. And you combine that with travel anxiety, and then you really do get people behaving badly. So on Christmas Day, I was spat upon by a drunk passenger who had somehow made it on the plane. And I didn't quite know what to do with that. But again, that's what I'm talking about when it was formative for me. I didn't enjoy getting spat upon by a drunk woman or by anyone for that matter. I wouldn't want anyone to spit on me. But it was the kind of sort of jarring awakening that I think served me better later on in adulthood. From being somewhat sheltered, I could see what was beneath the surface, right? It wasn't about the woman spitting. It really wasn't about her anger. It wasn't about her excessive use of alcohol. There was probably something deeper going on with her. And so the Lord used those experiences to open my eyes to humanity because I had such a limited perspective.
So, okay, let's get into a couple of case studies with my life. I now travel almost full time. I'd like to run two scenarios by you as a veteran flight attendant and get your take on it. The first one is, just for the sake of our audience, one of the simplest ways to discover your anxiety is when someone violates your values. Someone violates your core values, and that will generally make you anxious. That would explain a lot of the political anxiety that we see nowadays, why social media is a disaster for these kinds of conversations, because we're violating each other's values. Well, Joy, you mentioned people behaving badly. When I'm on a flight and somebody behaves badly, most commonly, they try to jump the line to get off the plane before it's their turn. I then behave badly. I tend to forget the Lord and become the judge rather than God being the judge. I'm now the judge. And I've stuck my arm out in the aisle before to stop people. I'm a big guy. I will physically get out of my seat when I can sense somebody behind me trying to jump the line so the people in front of me can get. I would just like to get your take. Am I a help or a hindrance in this situation? Because I promise you, I don't know.
Well, I
The pause
think,
is not encouraging to me.
well, I will say, yes, you're a hindrance. I have to think outside of myself, of my own brain, to consider what their circumstances might be. They might have a tight connection and they're trying to get ahead of the fray to make it. I've been there. I know what that's like. So there's that. You've got to consider the other person. But if you are the other person, how many seconds is it actually going to save you? Maybe 5, 6, 10 max. The 10 seconds of anxiety that you think you're saving, you're not really saving yourself because you're making yourself more anxious because you think you've got to get in front of these people. A phrase I like to say often is the juice ain't worth the squeeze on that. It's just not worth it. Steve, you published a column in the newly redesigned edition of Christianity Today magazine where you talk about a time where it upset you that someone else jumped ahead of you. You were unaware of that person's circumstance. Would you like to unpack that for the listeners?
Oh, it's one of my most embarrassing moments. And it only happened a couple of years ago. And the great irony is I was returning home from teaching an anxiety workshop in Chicago. I got to say though, Joy, I was flying from O'Hare Airport, which I do believe is the devil's lair. So I don't know if that's fair. It may or may not make the final cut, but I think O'Hare is a particular playground of the enemy. But anyway, yes, flying home to Denver, the family behind me jumped the line. The teenage girl gets ahead of me. I stick my arm in the aisle. I address the family behind me. This is mortifying, and tell them, look, let's wait our turn. And then come to find out later from the flight attendant that that teenage girl was having a panic attack. She was just trying to get to safety, and of course, my lesson being that when we're reactive, we lose touch with reality, which is what I've done. I have good news for my audience. I have plenty of modern bad examples from my own life I can share on anxiety management. That's definitely one of them. Second anxiety situation, Joy. I was taking a short flight, just long enough to watch a full movie. And I decided instead of working, I'm just going to chill, watch a movie. I watch Armageddon, the classic, Bruce Willis, Ben Affleck, and Liv Tyler. And toward the end of the movie, Bruce is stuck on the meteor. He's giving his life. He's sacrificing himself for the world. And he and Ben Affleck had a very volatile relationship. Ben is dating his daughter in the movie. And Bruce gives his blessing on the meteor back to Earth where Ben is, gives his blessing. And I'm bawling like a baby. I am crying so hard at Bruce Willis blessing Ben Affleck to now marry his daughter. I get off the plane when we landed and I immediately Google, do planes make you cry? Because I don't feel, Joy, that I should be crying that hard at Armageddon. It's an absurd movie. It's fun and funny, but it should not grab my heartstrings. Well, sure enough, there's all this empirical evidence, and there's a wonderful This American Life article on why you cry, why your emotions are much more heightened at altitude. And so that made me feel so much better about my movie experience. But I was curious your reaction to that.
I think that makes sense. And I don't know if part of it is when we travel, um, there are really silly reasons people just behave differently when they travel. But I do think there are some somewhat deeply philosophical reasons. And I think one of those reasons for anxiety when travel is our loss of perceived control. We're all control freaks to a degree.
Yeah.
Some of us more than others. And when we have lost the perception that we are in control of things, that makes us more emotionally volatile. Now, in your case, I don't know that that's necessarily the reason. But case in point, I fly. I don't fly as much as you do, Steve. I probably travel at least by air once or twice a month, usually once. But when I can, I love a road trip. And I think it's because now, if it's more than 5 hours, I'm flying. But there's this perception of control. Now, ultimately, we're not in control of it. But there's this perception of control. We're behind the wheel. We can control when we stop to get gas. If we see something that we want to pull over and sort of double click on a little bit, whether it's a beautiful mountain range or a shop, we can stop and we have control over that. So I do think there is something also, in addition to what you're saying, that makes us anxious when we travel, is because we like to call the shots. And whenever someone else is flying the plane, someone else is doing air traffic control, someone else is making decisions about weather delays, all those things, that's beyond our control. And we like having control. And that takes the literal and figurative wheel out of our hands.
It's really helpful because the big 5 sources of chronic anxiety, one of them is control. So it's really helpful to understand why people are a little more on edge. Joy, part of your career as a flight attendant was over September 11th, 2001. I would just love to hear what happened, what you were doing, what that was like for you.
9/11 was particularly formative because I would actually call that the first big crisis of my adult life. Now, there are other types of crises, or what we think are crises, right? Whenever we have a breakup in college or something like that. But this was an entirely different level. And it jarred me in such a way. And I think it really drove that point home to me that I am not in control here. Not only as a traveler, not only as an employee, not as a flight attendant, but I am not in control. God is. And it really helped me to rethink the way I show up in anxious situations. So September 11th happened. And then if you recall, those of us who are old enough to recall, I believe it was about 2 or 3 days later, airspace opened up again. Nobody wanted to go back to work. No one did. And so where I was based at the time, I had just a few months earlier that year, transferred from the Washington, D.C. area to Charlotte, North Carolina. That was known as a very senior base. And so that meant that I was very, very low on the totem pole, which also meant that if no one else wanted to work, guess who had to? And so because of my juniority, I don't know if that's a word versus seniority, but we'll go with it. Because of my juniority, I was one of the first people to go back to work in the airline industry. And I am not exaggerating when I tell you that when I was driving to the airport from my little starter home I had just purchased the month prior, my hands were shaking so violently driving to that. Nobody wanted to work. Not even seasoned flight attendants, not flight attendants who've been there, done that, were willing to sort of face the darkness in this sense. So I show up at the airport. There were more crew than there were passengers on my first flight. And I will tell you that, and you probably remember this too, the first month or two after 9/11, people were so kind on the airplane because I think whatever travel anxieties they had were overshadowed by this understanding of humanity. In that season in American life, we were all equals. We all had the same anxieties about traveling. We all had various levels. I don't want to say PTSD because I don't want to demean what actual PTSD is. But I think you know what I'm saying. We had the same triggers in those weeks and months following. And I think there was this sense of unity. There was this sense of equality. We understood that we all had the same fear and we all had the same hope that this wouldn't happen again. And I think because of that, people were kinder to us who were working in the airline industry.
Christianity Today has been around a long time. Obviously, this podcast is hosted by CT, and you are newer to the organization. What are you excited about what CT is doing nowadays?
Wow. Well, let me count the ways. I've found throughout my life that the Lord has been so kind to put me in places where, while it might trigger anxiety, there's also exciting change and the building of new things. So, before I came to Christianity Today in 2022, I'd spent 5 years at Lifeway, and that's where I got to know you, Steve. working together on a couple of different projects. But with any place I've been, there's always been a lot of change. So, and we can trace that back to my days as a flight attendant. Being a pre 9/11 flight attendant and a post 9/11 flight attendant, completely different. My job literally, it changed overnight. And that set the trajectory for the Lord really using things in my personal as well as my work life to prepare me for leading change in the future. And so, as you mentioned, CT has such a rich legacy. Billy Graham. So I actually have the distinct honor of having worked for two institutions founded by Billy Graham. So before I was at Lifeway, I spent 9 years at the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association as a writer editor, and now at CT I have that honor again. And part of that honor is working alongside our wonderful team. Our editor-in-chief, Russell Moore, I came on board around the time he began as editor-in-chief. And the honor of working at Christianity Today with this team, with Dr. Moore, the honor that will never, ever be lost on me. It's truly a gift from God. And he was just sovereign enough to bring me here. But one thing that excites me is several things. I'm holding up, if you are listening, I'm holding up our latest issue. Steve, I don't know if you have it in your inbox, but this is the November-December issue of Christianity Today. Earlier this year, we launched a redesign of the magazine. I am so proud of it. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about. So not only is it aesthetically beautiful, our creative team did an amazing job on it. Our creative director, Sarah Gordon, our art director, Jared Bogus, just so masterfully reimagined the way it could look, the way it could feel, the experience for the person holding it in their hands. It's just phenomenal. And then I worked alongside of my stellar team to really think through the content architecture, reimagine the content philosophy. And with the redesign, with everything we were doing, whether it was aesthetics or content, we really harkened back to our editor-in-chief's vision. So when Dr. Moore came to CT around the same time I did, he said a couple of things. He said, I would really love for CT to really be a community with personality. And he also wanted it to be a place where people who either did or didn't feel like they fit in any particular tribe of evangelicalism, who love Jesus, who love the Bible, who hold to biblical orthodoxy, who know that Jesus is who he says he is, and really convene and share ideas and read ideas and be changed and be sparked and to stir affections for Jesus in a fresh way. So one thing I'm excited about is the way we're approaching our time. We've got new things while we still have the things that people have loved for years. We still have testimonies. People have long loved our testimonies. That's not something we are letting go of. It's just a beautiful reminder, a very relatable reminder of Jesus' pursuit of all of us and how he doesn't just pursue us to bring us into the kingdom, though he does. He pursues us to make us holy, and he pursues us in friendship, and he pursues us to make us more like him. And so that's what those testimonies do. And they're never going to get old. And so that we've kept them. We still have great books content. We still do the book reviews that people like. Some new things we have are an advice column, which that was the brainchild of my colleague, Bonnie Christian. And it's called Qualms and Proverbs. And it is it's such a great way to add both heft and levity at the same time. And it's really what we needed. And something that's really fun about that is that Beth Moore, yes, that Beth Moore is one of our columnists. And Steve, you joined us as a columnist for this first year of our redesign. There are a lot of changes going on, but there's really, really good changes. And I'm really energized by them. And I hope our listeners and readers are as well.
Well, Joy Allmond, it has come to this. You have successfully navigated intoxicated passengers on a plane. You've had to sort out the very first flight in the air after 9/11. You have survived, possibly even thrived, through an annual Southern Baptist Convention, which I
Several of them.
think I've mentioned so far may be the biggest victory. And you have now successfully been my boss. I've got a couple of bosses at CT. You're one of them. And I could understand why being my boss would put you in a false sense of security that somehow you get to bypass the gauntlet of anxiety questions. But sorry to say, it's time to inflict them on you. What is one way that you treat other people that if you started treating yourself the same way, your life would be better?
Wow. That's a very good question. I have become aware that people often need space to process things, whether it's a family member or someone on my team or someone at church, if they're going through something hard. Sometimes instead of coming at them with thoughts or answers, they need space. And sometimes I don't give myself enough space to do that. I don't give myself enough margin to be thoughtful or to hear from the Lord or to be still.
Okay, very good. 2 questions to go. When the local church is at its best, what's something that it offers that you can't get anywhere else?
In our own small group, we have a woman who is battling her third round of cancer, stage 4 breast cancer. It spread into her bones, into her lungs. And our own pastor's wife was recently diagnosed with breast cancer. And so one thing that the church at its best does really well is provide for one another, whether that's a material need, whether it's bringing meals. You know, we've got meal training set up. We're signing up for days to bring meals. We're running errands for them. We are writing notes and mailing to them. We are praying for them. We're praying over them. We are spending time with them. And so when the church is at its best, we are meeting one another's physical needs, yes, but we're meeting all kinds of other needs. And I think that really goes back to having community, because you're not going to find that anywhere else. You're really not. You're not going to find that sense of belonging and that sense of gospel motivated love for people who really outside of the kingdom of God, you really would have no business spending time with. And that's what I love about the kingdom of God.
Okay. And final question, when in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
The past 2 years of my life, and I want to be careful to make the distinction here, they have been the hardest. They haven't been the worst, if that makes any sense. It's been the hardest. So August of 2022, I started an MBA. I finished it in a year and a half. Praise be to God. I started a new job at CT exactly a month later. 3 weeks after my start date at CT, I had a pretty bad hiking accident, completely broke my ankle. I did not walk for 3 months, had to have emergency surgery the next day. So I'm navigating a new job, an MBA, having to go to Knoxville from Nashville several Saturdays a month on a knee scooter with a cast, all at one time. And then the following year, just having to do the hard work of the MBA, the hard work of the job. And then the next year, we move back to North Carolina. So making a move to a different state. It's just a bunch of things that were just really hard. They're not bad. They're just hard. But I'd never felt more loved during that season, during this season. I'm sort of tapering off of those hard things because those are the times where God beckons us to walk more closely. He beckons us to come closer so that we can hear him whisper to us. He sends people around us who see us and minister to us whenever things are hard. And so I've just felt really collectively loved these past 2 years, even though it's been the hardest season of my life.
My guest has been Joy Allmond, the executive editor of Christianity Today. You know, back in the 90s and early 2000s when I was a youngster, as we like to say, I would spend so much time in a bookstore, just on the magazine rack, pulling a bunch of magazines off the shelf, had a couple of subscriptions. And then for years, everything was digital. And it's fascinating to me that last year I started subscribing to analog magazines again. I missed the idea of simply sitting in a chair and reading a magazine cover to cover. One of my all-time favorites to read, and I don't say this because I work for the organization, is the newly redesigned Christianity Today. It's beautiful. It celebrates art. It's wonderfully crafted. Joy, you're a big piece of that. Thanks so much for coming on Being Human.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for all you do at CT. Thank you for your ministry, and really appreciate the opportunity.